Yeah, so we are going to begin. Welcome everyone to the third session of the Policy Legislation and Governance webinar series. Today, we are having our webinar on human mobility across the urban-rural continuum in the time of COVID-19. This webinar is jointly organized by the Policy Legislation and Governance section in cooperation with the Program Development Branch of UN-Habitat. I would like to thank to the organizing team, my colleagues at the section, and also to our moderator today, Stephanie Lose, who is going to chair the session, and it's also part of UN-Habitat and the organizing team for this webinar. So, Stephanie, the floor is yours, and yeah, we can begin. And I wish you all a wonderful and very insightful webinar. Just one little reminder, we also have the chat box, so please post your questions, comments, yeah, so we can enrich the discussion. At the end, we hope we can collect some of these questions and transfer to the speakers to be answered. So yeah, Stephanie, please.
Thank you very much, Camilo, and thank you very much, all of you, for joining. I'm very happy on my side to actually chair and moderate this webinar. I think we've got fantastic speakers, and I'm really very much looking forward to actually hearing the content, so I'll try to keep my introduction as short as possible. We've got really a broad range of speakers. We've got Dr. Severino, who is the Director of Health and Migration Program from WHO. We've got JAIME PUMAREJO, who is the Mayor of Barranquilla in Colombia. We've got Professor Rajan, who is an expert on migration from India and will introduce us to that context. We've also got DALIA ABULFOTUH, who is joining us from the regional office in Arab states from FAO. We've also got ELISA MONTOYA, who's the Secretary of Post-Conflict and Culture of Peace in the Cucuta's Mayor's Office in Colombia. And finally, also very happy that we'll have Charles OBILA, who's working for IGAD as a migration officer. IGAD is actually the Intergovernmental Agency for Development, presenting countries like Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Uganda. So I think we've got really a broad regional balance, and I'm very happy actually that you've all joined. This is my first online moderation, so normally I would start this moderation by saying, please give the speakers a warm welcome clap, which at the moment, of course, you can't do. So I'll start by introducing a bit of the work of UN-Habitat in the migration and displacement context. We're the agency, as you know, for sustainable urban development, and that includes those contexts where we see rapid urban growth due to migration and displacement. Urbanization, I think that is sort of the common ground by now, if well managed and planned, has proven to bring a really positive economic, social, transformative change, not only to the cities, but also for the migrants themselves and for their families. For the migrants, because they can access better services, but also, of course, for the families due to the remittances that are being sent home. The development is also not only limited to the urban areas themselves, but also to the peri-urban and the surrounding rural areas because of strong urban-rural linkages, but also that can be fostered by integrated development approaches. And that is what the guiding principles and the guiding framework for urban-rural linkages and integrated territorial development, which maybe Remy, who's doing our closing remarks, might actually elaborate a bit more on. So rapid urban population growth, specifically in displacement and urban crisis contexts, does not in the first minute bring positive impact, but actually it brings quite a lot of challenges with it, including increased inequality, urban poverty, strain for service provision for local authorities, competition on natural resources, on housing, and of course, employment and livelihood opportunities. And among the most vulnerable, as always, are women, children, and disadvantaged groups such as migrants or displaced people. The other important topic that has really changed our world is COVID-19. It has hit the entire world with many people dying and also, again, putting spotlights on inequalities. The access to housing and sanitation has become very, very important, and also the access to services. You know, there are big inequalities for those who can actually afford or have access to services in developed countries, or actually don't have sufficient and adequate access to those in rather developing contexts. Also, the lockdown and so the social and economic responses that countries have found have changed our world, with regions who usually had like open borders now are being locked down, with cities like Nairobi, for example, where UN-Habitat has its headquarters, being under a complete lockdown. So that impacts, of course, supply chains from rural to urban areas, but also the other way around, from urban to rural areas. And it has actually cost a lot of people their jobs, those working in the formal sectors, but also those working in informal sectors. And as we will see during this webinar, and I'm keeping myself short now, COVID-19 has really impacted migration patterns a lot in both ways, as we will see in the different country contexts. Also, COVID-19 is spreading very fast in dense areas of cities. And in those areas, it's mainly urban poor, but also other disadvantaged groups like migrants and refugees who are living there. I wanted to highlight, before I hand over to our first speaker, I wanted to highlight that when UN-Habitat in this context speaks about migrants, we do include urban refugees, internally displaced persons, asylum seekers and refugees and other people on the move, because we do actually acknowledge their different rights and their different migration status. But for our work in urban areas, it is very important that we improve the living conditions for all, that we focus on human rights, that we improve the access to services, to housing, and enable everybody to lead a dignified life. So with those introductory words, let me hand over and warmly welcome our first speaker, Dr. Santino Severoni, who is the director of the Health and Migration Program at the World Health Organization. Dr. Severoni, WHO has spearheaded the work around COVID in the last months, and your team is also leading the UN Migration Network's working group on access to services. What are the areas that your team is mainly focusing on? What are the global recommendations, and how have migrants actually been impacted by COVID-19 in the recent months? And what are recommendations from your side? Over.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, good evening to colleagues connected in remote. I'm very pleased to share a few thoughts and consideration for later discussion and reflection on the issue of the public health implication of very important subject you just mentioned, the process of urbanization and making the urban setting fitting for purpose for the inhabitant, but also the situation vis-a-vis COVID, the COVID pandemic. The COVID response, the COVID pandemic has been by force bringing us in front of new realities. This is, of course, accepted and understood by everybody, but sounding even to be a bit provocative, I like to say reality which, from the public health point of view, have been in certain cases also source of inspiration and reflection for changes. So in the process of COVID response, the role of the urban setting, the community, the city has been, the municipality has been really central. For the first time, we have seen how, or we've been having the possibility to prove how non-health interventions like housing, education, communication, environment have been really playing a key role in responding to a pandemic, to a very important and concerning public health threat. We are preaching this in some ways as a WHO, but we also feel that this kind of linkage is not always picked it up either by politicians but also by people. And again, a big learning coming out from the COVID pandemic response is how the even developed health systems with very advanced hospital capacity have been facing a very critical situation. Basically, why? Because have been left a bit behind the element of public health, primary health care, community health. So really the baseline element of the entire public health service provision to a population. And again, this part of public health, it's lay in the structure within, is embedded in the structure of the communities, of the municipalities, even if the responsibility of service provision is not necessary with the communities, with the urban setting, but the service provider very often are the region or the national level. And this brought another important consideration that make us to reflect a lot. Mayors, municipality very often have been denouncing, have been flagging up the disconnect or the lack of consistency or participation in the policy formulation at national level for policy which have an enormous fallout on the community and municipalities. And again, COVID proved that if there is this disconnect between the national level planning and implementation at local level, we can face serious problems. Now, knowing that my time is limited, I put together not a presentation, but just 2-3 slides to provoke discussion and to show you and to convey to you some key messages. Next one, please. Stephanie, point out before, next one, please.
Yes, I think the team must have heard you. Thank you. Yeah.
Stephanie pointed out before to the challenges that migrants are facing. And in my case, I want to bring the attention to the public health challenges. And again, I'm not going to go through because this is a very well-known story. Everybody knows very well what I'm talking about. The difficulty to access services, the system, the barriers that migrants need to face, the financial hurdles, and many other stuff. Well, those things have been remain where they are, so remain obstacles in access, but actually COVID showed to us a spike increase of the inequity due to the situation. Who was poor, who was lacking basic means, stay without even in this situation, and who was having the possibility actually got a better treatment. I'll leave you just to imagine normal people, like could be you and me or anybody in this meeting. Imagine that you have one family member becoming COVID positive and you need to do all quarantine at home if you're living in an apartment. So imagine how challenge can be that one. Imagine when housing is not there. Imagine when we're talking about one of belonging to group of people, migrants, refugees, which they're having also numerous other difficulties. So next one, please. As I said before, the municipality, the urban setting, the city environment has been precipitated frontline in the COVID response. And interestingly is that when we went to look into how countries, how national government has been addressing this situation, we detect a very diverse type of approach So this was the first problem. There was not a consolidated, not a coordinated type of response to COVID in relation of inclusion of refugees and migrants, but this was basically responding to national approach and existing policies or initiatives. But the positive part, which I was saying before, the provocative and the hope, which I was saying before, we have seen countries that in a very pragmatic way, they included refugees and migrants in full access to service in what we call WHO universal health coverage type of approach. So really with an inclusive approach for those populations. And again, the 60%, because if they were not sick, most of the treatment, the COVID response has been represented by physical distancing, and I like to underline not social distancing, but social connection in physical distancing. And in fact, the initiative of solidarity, of social connectivity in a context of physical distancing launched by the community open up a new page of public health, primary health care, and taking care of the population, especially at the urban area. Next. Main issue is also to measure what was the reality. And here is coming the problem that we are confronting with a very fragmented availability of evidence, data, telling us, and not only to us, but giving us evidence, making us credible to stand in front of a minister or a decision maker in the health sector to say, look, the pattern is this one, and you have to do this if you want to make sure that you're going to have a positive result. So when we are talking about COVID, all of you knows how difficult it has been, and it is, because we are learning by managing this pandemic because it's a new virus. Then in the case of migrant refugees, the situation became even more complex because too often migrants, refugees remain the forgotten part of our society or those not visible. The result is that the few studies conducted show a concerning high morbidity and mortality among refugees and migrant population living in arrival countries. Not only, but the element of poverty, the element of social exclusion, the element of social failure in escalating the social development of community, not even migrant, and I'm referring to the study done in the US, show a really spike increase in mortality among those sector of the society. And again, these informations, those data are of course important from the public health point of view, but the remedy, probably the first intervention, is at the urban level. So the access to job, access to education, access to housing, access to hygiene, it's with the community, and we need to close the cycle of communication, but also involvement in the decision-making process of mayors or manager of the urban setting with those designing national policy. Next one, and I'm going to conclude. Why all this is important? Well, the analysis that we've been doing from the public health point of view show to us that there are social and environmental explanations, so what we call the determinant of health, so not necessarily health issues, but related to living condition, related to life course, related to diet, related to habit, risky or non risky habit, but also related to the fact that migrant and refugees show a different prevalence of mortality because those people are the ones usually doing the retail or service type of jobs, which were continuing even during the lockdown or the acute phase of the pandemic. Bus drivers or cleaning the roads. So those jobs which usually expose to an higher risk because those services could not be interrupted, and they are run mostly by those people. Then the biological explanation probably is the more technical, more medical, and it's related to genetical and also living conditions. But then I like to put the accent once more on the necessity to address a coherence a coordination, a consistency between national policies and local level administration, particularly in relation to migration, refugees, health, where inclusion and integration is the pathway to healthy living and healthy life. I'm stopping here and apologizing if I took a few minutes more, Stephanie.
No, that's perfectly fine. Thank you. And I thank you very much for, bringing us to those new realities, as you said. And I think some of the things you've actually mentioned are very important because they give quite a good lead over to our next speaker. So you mentioned, first of all, that, local authorities feel a disconnect to the national level, but also that they bear the strong part of responsibilities. And you also mentioned that many of them actually showed a really high level of solidarity with migrants and refugees, opening up their services and really making sure their service provision is inclusive. And I think that is actually really a good spotlight now to turn over to the mayor of Barranquilla in Colombia, JAIME PUMAREJO. I'm sorry, I might pronounce the name wrongly. I'm really sorry. Barranquilla is among the cities in Colombia most impacted by the Venezuelan refugee crisis. This has been going on for years. In addition to the Venezuelan migrants, the city has also been facing large-scale rural-urban migration over the last years. Maybe you could just explain to us what your city has actually been doing, how migration patterns have actually changed in your cities, and what your responses were. So thank you very much, and a warm welcome to the Mayor of Barranquilla. Thank you.
Thank you. And you indeed said my name correctly, I would say to 95%. So we're good in that. You're doing good. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so actually, yeah, it's a topic that's interesting because, as you said, there is a I would say a view that is taken from a top when we're talking about migration, that can be taken as a political view, as a political statement, in which I think most of us agree that it is an issue that has no boundaries, that we are human beings, we live in this world, and we sometimes need our help. So with that in mind, how do we make that help available and make it in a way that places the least stress in our fiscal systems, in our way of life, and how do we help these people that need help? So it is a challenge. I would say around 1.8 to 2 million Venezuelans now have migrated to Colombia. Around 10% of those are in our metropolitan city, in our metropolitan area, and they make up between 7 to 10% of our population right now. So that is a large part of our population. There have been a couple of waves of migration. The first wave was, I would say, people that had means and had a lot, were business people or were investors, which could leave early and start again. A lot of them started up with a lot less than they had back home, but they were able to restart their lives. The second wave was, I would say, people that had a degree, that had a way of making a new life and came over and started again and have been here for, I would say, a couple of years. The third wave of migration that we've seen are the people with the highest needs in the basic basic pyramid, or the bottom part of the economical pyramid, in which they need a lot more help. People with basic studies or no studies at all, families that have come looking for refuge and literally get off the bus and sleep on the sidewalk until they find something to eat or to do. They have a hard time. In Barranquilla, they have found a place where there is a lot less xenophobia, or I would say they are welcome in a sense, because it is a city of immigrants. It is a city that was not founded, but is a city that grew with different migration patterns from obviously Spanish, but German, Italian, French, British American, Jewish, Palestinian, Syrian, everybody that fled from somewhere came to Barranquilla. So we are a city that is open to the world, and the Venezuelans have felt that, and they have seen that here they can find a new beginning. So in a sense, that is why we have, well, I would say 10% of our population is Venezuelan at the moment. Secondly, the way we talk, the way our customs are more akin to them. The interior of our country is more Andean. So I would say they feel that the coastline, the coastal northern coast, the Atlantic coast of Colombia, the Caribbean coast is more like them. So maybe they find similarities, and it is closer. This is just a theory. I can't back it up with data. But that is what we talk to them, or what they tell us. So that is what has been happening for the last couple of years. But institutionally, we are not accustomed to seeing immigration, be it legal or illegal. We are accustomed to Colombians leaving, looking for better opportunities, not for people coming to Colombia. So our migration systems, our institutions were not set up for that, for their control, so that it can be done properly. Because we're not saying we don't want it to be done, we just want it to be done properly. We want people to have their visas, their permissions, which are very easy to obtain. The border has never been closed, but if we do it properly, we can better serve these people and get them the help they need in education and in health and whatnot. So having said that, we had to adapt quickly. And what was done was that with a local government, we had to absorb, just to give you some data, 20,000 of our students, of 210,000 students that we have in our public education system are Venezuelans, and they receive free education, as does all of our children in our public health system. If they are in part of the 100,000 that receive free food every day in school, it is not discriminated between Colombians and Venezuelans. If they need it, they get it. So they receive the same education and services as do our kids. And in the same way, in last couple of years, the health system, our local health system, took care of, or took hold of, the benefits that they needed to be able to receive treatment. The problem that we were having is that we were bearing all the cost. So Barranquilla was probably paying about $1 million a month between health and education fees. What we ended up doing with a government is including them in our national system, which gives them sort of like an insurance. So now they are part of our public local health system. And they are co-subsidized between the national government and the local government. And when they enter that, they receive treatment through our public system, but they receive treatment at a fiscal cost that is comparable to the cost that a Colombian has. So it is much less, but in a sense, we are still making up for it, or paying the difference of the bill, but it is not fiscally impossible to pay at the moment. And during COVID, which we've Barranquilla is of the capital cities of Colombia, is the first city to have reached the peak of the first peak of contagion, and reach a significant amount of deaths. Although we were able to pass this first wave without the collapse of our health system, we did have a lot to do, and more than 500,000 food packages were delivered across the city. A significant amount of those were to Venezuelan community settlements, and as a whole to Venezuelans, because as I said, as they are in the neighborhoods that need the most, we concentrated our food aids into those neighborhoods. So we were able to give them the help they wanted, or they needed, or more so than wanted. And with the UN and other institutions, we are giving about 1,300 servings of food to the migrant population. So I don't want to bore you with details. What I would like to say is the Colombian institutions and the local governments have gone out of their way to try and figure this out. We haven't done so in the sense that we need to see this as a positive impact for our city and for the country. I think that we are receiving a workforce that in a couple of years, we will be able to take pleasure of adding to our economy. We have seen a positive impact. There are issues that we need to work on. The way our political and our economical and our social system is set up in Colombia is very different from the one that many people are accustomed to in Venezuela. Our social aids are more geared toward giving people I would say the tools that they need to, through labor and work, develop their own well-being, whereas Venezuela has collapsed into I would say a subsidy-based economy, so that some migrants have a different, I would say, are accustomed to a different set of state benefits. And we are working towards, I would say, socializing them to the new way of life in Colombia. And we have a migration center that helps them with that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much so far for sharing all this information. And I think it's very, very important, to actually hear from you as a mayor, not only how generous you've been and, or the Colombian system in general, and about all of those inclusion and integration mechanism that you've established. But also, I think most of the world really understands the challenges that you've been going through, as you just described, with 10% of your population actually, coming into the system as newcomers, and the effort it actually takes to integrate them and include them into systems. So thank you very, very much. We'll get back to you also to understand a bit more about the different migration patterns that you've been seeing, or if Barranquilla has actually experienced different migration patterns due to COVID. We'll get back to that. I want to remind everybody, please, if you have any additional questions or comments, that if you can please post them in the chat. After our next speaker, Professor Rajan, we will have a short discussion round, so you can come up with questions and suggestions on your side. Thank you very much, Mayor, and I will now hand over to Professor Rajan. Professor Rajan is a specialist in the Indian context. Due to time, I would kindly ask you to, just give a short introduction in order that then people can also ask their questions and you can actually reply based on your expertise. So Professor Rajan, I think one of the main questions is actually, what changes has India experienced regarding migration patterns due to COVID from rural areas, or also, and I think this is the case in India, we'll be happy to hear from you, regarding migration patterns that have actually changed. So while before there was a strong rural-urban migration, I think COVID has changed the situation quite a lot. So please, over to you, Professor Rajan. We'll be happy to hear from you. How's the situation in India, and how has COVID-19 actually changed migration patterns between rural and urban areas? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen A., for the introduction. And I am going to put you some facts to start with. When we talk about internal migration today, we have close to 600 million people in India who are living in a place they are not born. So that is the biggest number we are talking about. Among them, 200 million people who are either inter-district migrant or what is called the interstate migrants. They were moving within the district or what is called the within the states, because India is like a European Union. So we have 35 territories within India. So the lockdown created what is called the complete mobility was completely closed. From March 24 to almost lockdown period 1 and lockdown period 2, almost 1 month, people were not allowed to move because people thought COVID can be stopped if you ask the people not to move. I think there is a direct link between migrants and COVID. I think that is one of the reasons government went in a very strong way to stop people moving. But in fact, that basically they failed. India has failed its internal migrants because of the lockdown policies, and the internal migrants, especially from the cities, because 50% of the Indian migrants are living in big cities, and cities were very highly affected by COVID. If you talk about Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai, and they account for almost 60 to 70% of the COVID cases in the respective states. And people were just running because either they have jobs, either they have salaries, either they have social space because they're all living in slums. So people were started moving, and then government came back after 1 month, probably middle of May. They started what is called the special trains to move people from cities to rural area. I think that is something what they did was really moving virus from cities to rural area. I think that was the biggest mistake India has done, because at the time of March 24, India had just 500 COVID cases, just 500. And that time they asked people not to move. And when the COVID reached 300,000, of course, today we are talking about almost third rank in the world. They asked the people, they given special train move from cities to villages. Now the COVID has completely spread throughout the country, not the cities. It has gone back to every part of India because the government did what is called the wrong policy of allowing people to go after the 1 month of lockdown. I think that created a biggest problem. And along with that, what happened? The return migrants were started moving from cities by walk, by train, by buses. In fact, one of the migrants told in one of the meetings, we were transported to our villages like livestock. I think this is a very strong statement made by the migrants, like livestock. That means they are not even treated as human beings. I think this is a very serious issue happening in this country. And the second point is, this is the first time, probably this is the first time of the Indian migration history, return migrants are going back with empty hands. They have no money. They were begging for their train tickets and food. The Supreme Court of India came to their rescue, saying that don't charge them any money either for food or for travel. Please send them back from cities, free trains. I think the Supreme Court has to interfere. The lockdown made the migrants as almost begging for their food. They made them beggars. And then if you look at the other economic context is that these migrants were fighting poverty from villages, fighting what is called the malnutrition, fighting unemployment. Now, these migrants become what we call them, they were heroes for their family. They were made zeros by COVID and lockdown. They were zeros, and you made them also a carrier of COVID. There is a stigma coming from any city. I think that is the biggest damage we have done for them. Stigma. If you go from anybody coming from city to villages, people look at them in a stigma, like a carrier is coming from Mumbai, Chennai, Delhi. I think we have done a great injustice to them. And finally, before I stop, I think COVID also created what I think is something between the middle class and the poor class. I think middle class, people like us, work at home in that context. We made the migrants, basically they were the highly affected people. The middle class designing policies so that the poor are affected more. I think there is a class dimension is happening in India. I think the COVID has no problem. It goes to everybody. But the highest affected people are poor, slum dwellers, and the cities with no space to even live. I think I'm going to stop here because of the time, and I'll come back with some queries and questions. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajan. I mean, this is really quite a unique and really horrible situation to see how governments trying to react, and I would assume they're doing it with good faith, but in the end, you know, sort of all the measures taken somehow turned out to be really counterproductive. And I think what you've also mentioned, which is really important, so specifically in India, but I think also in other country colleagues, COVID-19 has not only, you know, created a huge economic impact with people losing their jobs, but it's also really a big social impact with, you know, the stigma you mentioned, with people returning empty-handed, being from heroes to zeros. I think that is really a social phenomenon, which is really going to, well, be challenging over the next years. I thank you very much. And yes, we'll definitely come back to you also for more questions. Maybe I would now like to hand over to the audience and see if there are questions from the audience. I think, STINEKE, you were the one who actually proposed to ask the first question. Over to you for first question, and then we'll take more questions that have been received in the chat box. Thank you very much. Would you maybe just introduce yourself when you're speaking, so that everybody knows who this comment comes from? Thank you. So over to you, STINEKE.
Thank you so much. Sure, I can quickly introduce myself. I'm STINEKE UNEMA. I'm the coordinator of the UN System Standing Committee on Nutrition. And in fact, I do not have so much of a question, but rather a comment reacting to the three earlier speakers, as I was invited to do by the organizers. So first of all, a big thank you to the three speakers. I really appreciated the three presentations, giving a very interesting overview, starting already from the comment of our colleague from WHO, stating that COVID is already very much looking at how other sectors have an impact on health, on the health sector. And that's the thing I will come back to in my comment all the time, the interlinkages between several of the sectors. Again, the mayor said in his comprehensive package that he made available to the migrants, from social protection to food aid to even health insurance. It's beautiful, and you need to bring these elements together if you want to have a very strong impact on well-being of people. And that's where I come from, the well-being and nutritional status of people. I'll get back to nutrition in a minute. And then the last presenter from India, stating clearly, as you also said, the social and economic impacts from heroes to zeros. So what I don't need to repeat for this audience is that there are no strict edges, boundaries between these urban and rural settings. We are speaking about migration here. And the beauty of the three presenters is that, and what I would like to bring in this discussion is that when we look at food systems, when we look at food and nutrition, if you use that as an entry point, you can really start working on the improvement of well-being of people and increase the resilience of the local systems, of the territorial, let's say, boundaries of the well-being of people. So how to do that? First of all, that notion of inequity that was mentioned by the three speakers, let's go back to that one. In the context of COVID, in the context of inequity, we look at migrants. When we look at a very special group of migrants, we look at seasonal food migrants, people that work in the food value chain. Especially these people are important and have an impact on the food system. And that becomes so clear in the pressure cooker that is called COVID-19 these days. We see these people have low income. We see they're especially vulnerable to COVID. They are less protected in a work environment. And because they cannot come to their work, we see that these these food value chains, especially of high value products, are disrupted. They are fragile. And that again shows to consumers in the bigger setting. Consumers suddenly realize, hey, we need these people. hey, I can't see my favorite vegetable, or I can't even see any vegetables in where I normally can buy these stuff. So this has really an impact, not just on the food system, but also on nutrition, because especially these higher nutritious products are not available anymore, or only at a higher cost, then again, increasing inequity. We have done a little bit of work related to this, and when we want to improve the situation, several studies already have shown that we have to move back to more local food systems, more territorial food systems. So again, in that context of urban-rural linkages, make that food system a little bit more simple, make it a little bit more, let's say, robust, less fragile, resilient in the context of disruptors, climate change, and now COVID-19. So how to do that? First of all, these migrant workers, again, expand the social protection, include them in social protection mechanisms so that they are safe and they can do their job. But also look at the food system, diversify the food system. Don't be just reliant on one crop, but make sure it's resilient, it's diversified, so it can sustain a shock or two, including COVID, including climate change. And finally, social protection, food, and finally health systems, make them very much aligned with each other. So in short, let me just repeat that main message again. When looking at the food system and nutrition, it really gives you an entry point to work on the well-being of people in a locality, in a territorial approach, taking into account these several elements of well-being, health, nutritional status, and equity, not the least, of course. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I may step in later in the conversation again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, STINEKE, and thank you also for mentioning, first of all, the importance of, healthy food, and also the increase in prices in healthy and nutritious food. I think, that is something, if we manage to still access healthy food, we can also, of course, we're a bit more resistant. But then also in East Africa, in the context that UN-Habitat headquarters colleagues are with me, we can actually see food prices going up. And as I said before, we can actually see food production chains that have really been interrupted in many different regional contexts. As I said, example also in West Africa, where food chains really rely on the regional trade, which has just been closed while it is usually open. So we've got two questions to, thank you very much for your intervention. So we've got two questions now. I'll take some from the chat. We've got two questions for Professor Rajan. And thank you everybody for actually putting questions in the chat. I think this really makes it easier for us as a moderating team. So one question was on how did the countries cope with elderly's mobility in migrant populations in the COVID-19 situation? So that is a question in India, but it could also be answered actually in other contexts. And the other question to Professor Rajan is that now that migrants are in their native places, what about their livelihoods, and what urgently is needed to address the crisis in the rural areas? So thank you very much, first of all, Professor Rajan, for answering those questions. And then we'll also take some more questions for the other speakers as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I think I would like to take the second question first, because I think this is very, very important, because the people are, as I said earlier, people are going without any money, empty hands. They are going as zeros. And the government of India, very, very sad, government of India, when they announced 20 lakh crore financial package, there was only 3,500 crore for migrants. And what do they provide? They provide 5 kg rice per ration card for the migrant families for May, June and July. They were not done anything on March and April and May. They were all not having, because when we talk about between life and death, the migrants are talking between life and livelihoods. They lost everything and they are going back. What we are seeing now, there is going to be a biggest starvation happening in villages. Starvation, because starvation, as somebody already talking, the price has gone up. They have no purchasing power, they have no money, they have no savings, and they are also worried about COVID. I think this is a very serious situation, and we were asking the government of India to give them cash transfer. But I was talking in many meetings, told them at least give them 25,000 rupees, which is equivalent to maybe something like $500, $600. But only one state government announced we are going to give $15 for all the migrants. I think they need money. So what is happening now? There is a social stress, there's a psychological stress, and what we are seeing now, the migrants, returned migrants are going to, already I'm seeing they are committing suicides. We used to talk about farmer suicides in India. Now we are seeing returned migrants going back, seeing their families, and they could not do anything for them. And there are already evidences coming from a lot of villages, returned migrants are committing suicide. I think this is going to be a serious thing. And we are telling respective government, give them food security, give them free food, and give them some hard cash because they need money. I was talking to some migrants. They said that they are giving rice, but how do we cook? What will eat along with the rice? I think this is a very serious concern. There is a big rural distress. I think everybody talking about that, including the Prime Minister now. And they are talking about giving employment, they are talking about giving housing, but what we are asking them now to give them hard cash transfer, give them cash in their hands. This is what we are talking about in the depression earlier, in historically. You have to promote, give them cash, and it is called animal spirit. You have to create an animal spirit among the rural people. They will only spend. If you give them 1,000 rupees today, it will not be with them. It will come back to the economy. I think government has to realize. Some state governments are already started talking about that. Some government has given the money. I think this is a very serious issue. The second point about the elderly, I think what happened, the migrants are most likely what is called the adult age groups, because the government has already put elderly should not move. They said less than 10-year-old children and 65, they are not supposed to move for the last 4 months. Last 4 months. And of course, nobody knows. Old man is walking, you don't know. We are not going to ask his age. But there are many households in the villages. There are only elderly because the adult members are away from the city. So I think they were going out. But the migrant scenario, if you see the railway track, if you see the what is called the people who are running to the back to villages, most of them are young, adult, youth, and there are some women because there are some family migrants. I think I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much. No, I mean, honestly, I'm very touched, as you said, you know, that the psychological stress is so high that people start committing suicide. I think that is a very, very big sign for also the Indian society. And I think this is really, really very shocking. I know the mayor of Barranquilla has to leave our webinar. So maybe I'll try to pronounce the name again, Mr. PUMAREJO. Maybe you would just like to give us some conclusory remarks. I hope the situation is not that bad in Barranquilla at the moment, but over to you for final remark. Thank you.
Yes, Stephanie, thank you. I think we're past the worst of the pandemic at the moment. We reached 95% of occupancy in our ICUs. Currently, we're at 69%. Our excess death crept up to 5 times our daily average. We're yesterday and the day before were actually days where we were spot on to the daily average of our last 5 years. So we had no excess death because of the pandemic. So it appears that things are looking up, and this gives us an opportunity to start gradually opening up other sectors of our economy that are those most, I would say, influenced by the migrant, I would say, population, which is the service sector. Mostly next month, we plan to open restaurants in a reduced capacity. We plan to open up, I would shops and other things for public, which are also highly intensive in the migrant population, in labor. So there are a lot of things that this this has taught us. One of those is how to include, and this is a discussion that we're going to have nationally, is how do we include these people rapidly into our system? They are not going away. They are not going to be returning to Venezuela anytime soon. They are, as we've said, they are part of Colombia at the moment, and maybe they will be forever. So we need to include them, give them the tools to become productive members of society, to abide by our rules and our system, and in that sense, take hold and responsibility in shaping our future collectively now. So I think these are interesting challenges. I think Colombia has done fairly well. It has had an impact, a fiscal impact in our system, and we still need a lot of help. And I would like to open up, I would say, a thought process. I read an article or a study a couple of months ago, which we've been circulating in Colombia, about the difference in earnings that a migrant earns in his native country or territory and the place where he moves to, and how that difference in wage earnings could be tied to a tax or a system in which they give back to the recipient country or whatnot a portion of their increased earnings that go into helping them with tax, with health, education, and whatnot, and that would help speed the process up of a lot of things. And also, I think the population of the recipient country would feel that they are sharing the burden and not, I would say, paying for the whole humanitarian relief. So it is an interesting question. It does not come without pitfalls, but I think it is on the right path. So I leave that open for discussion in later meetings. But thank you very much for the invitation, Stefan.
No, thank you very much. And we really appreciate that you took time for this webinar. I know as a mayor at the current situation, it is always the question of resources, and we really very much appreciate that you took the time to join. Thank you very much appreciated.
Thank
you. Before we go over to the last panel, I would actually like to address two questions to Dr. SEVERONI. There are two questions that were put in the chat. One is actually if you could just maybe introduce some steps that were taken to address the issues of boosting immunity of migrants, and how local health systems were useful and what was actually done to include, or what sort of recommendations were given from a global perspective. And the other one is if you could maybe just say some words about a more territorial approach for planning health services, because I mean we all know about the inequalities of access to services in rural and in urban areas, and actually regional planning and integrated territorial approaches could help for that. And if there are any recommendations that IOM has actually, WHO has actually handed out those last weeks, or if there's been considerations on this. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. With regards, I'm starting from the second question. Well, recommendation for local planning, it's something which it has been addressed and it has been discussed with networks of mayors belonging, I don't know if you are aware about the WHO is managing a network called Healthy City. And the mayor of this Healthy City network, in order to become part of the network, they need to show complying to a certain minimum requirement of healthy approach. And those recommendations are part of a regular type of package, and the community of mayors is extremely attentive to the element of migration, because in many countries has been also observed a phenomenon where the relocation after the first arrival of migrants in a country, the relocation was taking place by decision of the government deploying migrants in a local community without the consent or without the discussion with the local community. Simply they need to manage. And this has been generating quite of a number of issues. Not last, the fact that the growing attention on the migrant community worldwide has been generating sensitiveness and resentment sometimes in the local community hosting the migrants. We have saw riots, we have seen local community rejecting labor migrant of the same nationality coming back home during the COVID crisis, exactly because of the stigma, because of the attention given to that. So the element of really having a circular integration or belonging to a community, to have the community be informed and educated and updated on the reality is paramount. The other element is represented by, as I was saying before, housing, schooling, and labor market. Basically, those three elements made a person healthy or unhealthy. Lack of job, housing, and education, it's the ideal combination for mental health disorders, or even worse, even chronic diseases or communicable diseases if your social exclusion is as such that you are only having access to very deteriorated social environment. So this is something that the element of provision of services is not just because of a humanitarian feeling. In this we are quite assertive, which is fine, but in my view should be anchored to a human rights principle. So there is a minimum which we cannot compromise to, and a minimum of quality and a minimum service provision that everybody needs to be accessing. Otherwise, we are really deteriorating the fundament of our society and the principle on our society is based on. The first question, sorry, Stephanie, can you remind me quickly what you were asking?
The first question was on steps that were taken for boosting the immunity, or, you know, steps that were actually taken to support health services to migrants.
We have an incredible list of wonderful initiatives, from the migrant working in the vegetable market, then start to supply food to national people in condition of fragility, vulnerability, because they know what does it mean, and during COVID they wanted to do something to help the community which hosts them. Or the engagement of municipality in offering housing and support to those families which could not actually have the sufficient means for physical isolation or safety conditions. In many cases, we were very strong in advising that the camp-based or camp-like type of setting should be discouraged, especially as a principle, but also as a during the COVID response, because the camp-based or camp-like setting community, they are extremely difficult to implement the necessary hygiene conditions, physical isolation, access to water, access to sanitation, which are paramount for the prevention of COVID. And we have seen really incredible example, redestination of common premises, military bases, or premises belonging to the community, to the city hall for this purpose. So we have seen a lot of goodwill. I was told before, a lot of also solidarity. Unfortunately, also some cases of non-solidarity or some case of resistance. But I would say majority, COVID has been played this important role, has been uniting the community. People share the same threat, so they felt equal, they felt facing, so a lot of stereotype concepts that usually people having about migration, they were basically destroyed or somehow forgotten during the acute phase of COVID.
Okay. Well, no, thank you very much for mentioning it, for mentioning actually both components. On the one hand, that, you know, inequalities in access to services or the competition on those services actually increases the risk of, you know, exclusion and actually threatens social cohesion, while on the other hand, the opportunity because of COVID that, you know, people feel this is something which is not based on a migration status, or it's just actually the vulnerability of people, the vulnerability of my neighbor, the vulnerability of people living right next to me, that actually creates a new wave of solidarity, which is, I think, a very positive sign. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you, Stephanie.
You're welcome. And thank you also for mentioning the Healthy Cities Network. I think that is also something that more people or listeners, the audience, might maybe want to come back, and maybe, I don't know, if there's any way that you could share a link to this Healthy City Networks in the chat box so other people can also access it later.
Certainly, I can share the link and the contact person, the focal person for WHO for Healthy City.
Thank you, that would be wonderful. Also, I think from UN-Habitat side, what you mentioned, you know, that the provision of services, the access to housing, the access to sanitation is something that, you know, we always keep highlighting, and we also think COVID now gives the opportunity to put a spotlight again on challenging situations in urban areas, or also in the peri-urban areas where a lot of peri-urban poor live. And that in the end, you know, we have to raise awareness to governments to actually use COVID as a wake-up call to reduce those inequalities and actually increase the access to services for poor, urban poor, specifically when it comes to housing, sanitation, and that also makes sure that those inequalities between the rural and the urban areas actually reduced in this field. So thank you very much to the first panelists. I think it was an amazing, enriching discussion until now, and we'll now sort of hand over to our next panelists. The first speaker is DALIA ABULFOTUH, who's working in the regional office for the Near East and North Africa in FAO. So bringing in and highlighting again the perspective of, well, rural population and the challenges rural populations might face, but also, you know, again, bringing in the component of food and how important healthy and the access to food overall is important. Thank you very much, Dalia, for being with us today. And yeah, happy to hear from you, stories from country offices, the impacts on food systems, urban-rural linkages. Over to you. Thank you. You might still be unmuted because at the moment I cannot hear you, Dalia.
Hello, yeah, sorry, I was indeed muted and my slides keep flipping. Sorry about that. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm happy to reiterate on some of the same points that many of the previous speakers have made. COVID-19 has really highlighted something we've always known, but is just now really underscored, and that is how important human mobility is to our economies, but also for individuals and households as a livelihood strategy. So in terms of food security, the impact of COVID-19 on food prices and availability worldwide has been generally mild. Of course, you've indicated that in certain contexts, certain countries, on certain continents, food prices have suffered. And in the MENA region, where I'm currently based, countries that are already suffering from conflict or crisis, conditions are now significantly worse. But in general, governments have been careful to ensure the functioning of agriculture supply chains throughout the pandemic. As many have noted, that nevertheless, food production has still seen a few challenges. And part of this has to do with the fact that much of the sector depends on migrant labor, whether international or internal, particularly seasonal and circular migrants. Of course, agriculture is not exactly something that can be done remotely. And apart from the constraints that have to do with human mobility, small-scale producers, small-scale and family farmers, particularly pastoralists and fisher folks, it's important not to forget them, have also had to deal with additional challenges related to changing demand and consumption patterns. For example, away from fresh fruits and vegetables towards less perishable cereals, which is also negative from a nutritional perspective. Difficulty in accessing markets locally and internationally, and we've had governments in our member states in the region report back on new difficulties in accessing seeds and pesticides and fertilizers among small-scale farmers. So, in other words, although overall food security is, we could say, stable, particularly in urban areas where most of the consumption takes place, food producers, on the other hand, have been more directly impacted by the pandemic. And this situation is threatening rural livelihoods and house.
I think we've lost Dalia. Okay, well, my Wi-Fi was down for a minute as well. Maybe the team can also signal me when Dalia's back. But I think what was reinitiated in her presentation, and I hope she will come back because she told us before that she's got some interesting regional stories actually from the Arab states region, but that there are 2 points which smallholder farmers are actually specifically challenged with at the moment. That is, on the one side, the access to markets, but on the other side also the access to fertilizers and seeds. So maybe while we're waiting for Dalia to come back, let me maybe give her 2 or 3 minutes. There she's back again. Great. Sorry, we lost you, Dalia. Sorry for the connection problems.
No, yeah, I really apologize. I'm trying. I'll just quickly just jump back in. I was just talking about the difficulty that farmers and rural residents have in coping with the decline in income and the sectoral challenges they're facing due to restrictions in mobility. And the inability to find supplementary work in urban centers or cities. In this region, as I'm sure is the case in other parts of the world, there's been a temporary decline in mobility from rural to urban areas, particularly among the less wealthy or blue-collar workers. So just for example, in a city like Cairo, which is home to 22 million people, at least 5 million more commute each day to work in the city. So you can imagine how many of these have lost jobs or suffered income reduction, even though Egypt never fully shut down its railways, but just the reduced hours affecting business operations. And as a result of this, how many households are no longer receiving remittances. Just as a final thought, at least for the Near East and North Africa region, COVID-19 is only the most recent in several crises that we've seen, and we anticipate that with the impacts of climate change and resource scarcity it will sadly not be the last. And so there's a critical need to build resilience, particularly of food systems, reiterating the points that have been made before, in order to continue feeding an increasingly large and urban population. And so that's why at FAO and in other organizations, we advocate for what we call a city region food system approach, which aims to foster a more resilient, sustainable food systems within cities, urban centers, peri-urban and rural areas in an integrated territorial approach. It really emphasizes the strengthening of rural-urban linkages by involving government units at different scales, whether provincial, municipal, or at district level, to create things like integrated urban food strategy. So in the interest of time, and I apologize once again for the connection, I will stop here and leave the floor to my colleagues. But I'm happy to answer any questions in the discussion, or you can send me an email.
Thank you very much, Dalia. No, I think you've really brought a really large number of important points. You also reiterated back to the point that STINEKE already mentioned, that specifically in crises like this, where we actually see from one day to the other, mobility is actually not longer taken, or cannot longer be taken for granted, that city, region and local food systems are actually one way to make sure urban populations can still have access to food. And I think food, of course, is one of the basic needs of everyone. So maybe I would propose that, because of the question of time, we would now go to the second speaker of the second panel. ELISA Montoya, who's the Secretary of the Post-Conflict and Culture of Peace in Cucuta's mayor's office in Colombia as well. So back to the Latin American context, from the Arab states back to the Latin American context. Ms. Montoya, maybe you could just also give us an overview. What are the main issues and what are the challenges that have sort of emerged in Cucuta? Over to you, and we'll try to then also make sure there's enough time for the third speaker, and there's also maybe time for another couple of questions from the audience. Thank you. Over to you, Ms. Montoya.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. I would like to share with you some really important words now. I changed my speech for this scenario last night at the last minute, because I would like to comment on this scenario, a very important and complex mobility dynamics that our territory is currently suffering. We are now living since July 18 and July 19, a massive forced displacement in our territory, in our rural area. And that's why I really wanted to share with you this situation, and I decided to change all my speech, because this is a really hard moment for me and for our community now. It's very hard for me to speak about it, and I really want to share with you a presentation, a really small presentation, and I'm about to share my screen with all of you.
Thank you very much. Please do so. Yes.
Give me just 1 minute. I lost my my presentation.
No, you'll have the time you need. Maybe while you search for the presentation. There it is. Good. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. I would like to share with you this massive forced displacement that we're living in our rural area, specifically in an area that is called Banco de Arena, where we have a very big population that is dedicated, or that works in the in the rural fields, in the coca fields, in the coca, with the coca seeds and all this situation. And I want to share with you that not even COVID-19 has stopped violence in our country, specifically in my city, in a really small city in the border with Venezuela, and that mobility dynamics due to the conflict has worsened during the pandemic, mainly due to the close relationship between the situation of the rural communities and the strategy of forced eradication of illicit crops that is led by the national government, which we as a local government radically opposed. We are now living a situation where we have 418 people living in a school, living in a temporal shelf, that were forced displaced of their homes, of their rural homes, and we are now with them. We are now trying to give them all the humanitarian resources, the humanitarian attention, but this is a really complicated situation, especially because of the COVID-19. We are really worried that our population that are living in this shelf maybe can get COVID-19 because of the situation, especially of the overcrowding that we're living in this school. We are now having another mobility situation due to the conflict that is happening right now as we speak, and that's why I've had some inconveniences to get to this scenario and to get to this webinar. But I tried to make the biggest effort to be with you because I wanted to share with you this. And we're having a second forced massive displacement in this same city. We're having a second massive displacement. We're having, according to the leaders, voice and the leaders' communications, about 700 people in this condition. And we're worried that our rural area is becoming not just a political battlefield for our national leaders, but also for the local associative political associations. Maybe we're seeing that this forced massive displacement is becoming like a political flag for some people now, and we are worried that this could get really worse in the next hours. I maybe will go into the territory in the next hours. But the really concerning thing is that our rural poverty, our efforts in getting closer the city with the rural area are getting or taking a slow path because of this situation. We are trying to make efforts for getting close our communities in the city and in the fields, and we're trying to fight the violence with work, with projects, with humanitarian help during the pandemic. We are trying to giving a company or maybe a help for our communities with all the programs. But in the pandemic, it's really hard to know that not even the COVID-19 has stopped the violence, that not even the COVID-19 has stopped or has changed the national thoughts about the illicit crops, about the voluntary substitution of the voluntary substitution about these crops. And that maybe is a part that is not really seen or is not very mass media talk about it. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but this situation in the rural area in our country, in our city, is getting worse because of the pandemic, because of the COVID-19. And we are now trying to talk to another people, to talk to other institutions, to maybe give a voice to all of them, to all of the farmers that are now trying to get to the cities, that are getting now like a negative stimulus or a negative incentivization to get to the cities. The displacement, the forced displacement, is making that the only people that were safe. Sorry.
No. I lost you for a second.
Yes, I could get that. Sorry, I'm going to repeat that small part. The only people that were safe for us in Cucuta about the COVID-19 were the farmers, were the people that were living in the fields, that were living in the rural zone, and now they are getting in danger because they are traveling to this part that is the city, that is the urban zone in our city. And it's really sad for us to know that the only people that were safe in this pandemic during the COVID-19 are now getting in risk. I don't know, I think that I lost you, Stephanie.
We can still hear you, Elisa.
Thank you. And just to finish, I would like to say that the only people that were safe in our country were the rural people, were the people that were living really far from the cities, because we have zero cases in the rural zones. Our farmers were safe until now, until the violence is getting to make traveling to the cities to change their homes, to change the farmers for the cities. And this during the COVID-19 is really worrying because we have no conditions to protect the people in the urban zones. Now you can imagine the challenge that is for us to protect these people that are traveling, that has zero clothes, hygiene, elements, that has zero elements to be safe in the cities. And during the COVID-19, this is getting worse. And this is a thing that we could analyze in this context, because it's not only really hard for the humanitarian thing or the humanitarian context, but for the health risk that these communities are living. With that, that's everything that I wanted to say, and I want to thank you, all of you, for listening to me, and for giving us a space for the local government to talk about this topic that is important for you and for all the world to know that is happening now in our territory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for sharing that with us, the situation in Cucuta and in Banco de Arenas, the rural area. We lost Stephanie, our moderator, so I'm going to continue. Now I would like to give the floor to our last panelist, Charles OBILA, who is a migration officer at IGAD Secretariat in Djibouti. So Charles, we are running like our agenda now is very tight. So I would like to ask you to kindly stick to 5 minutes to share with us your points and your message for this webinar. Welcome, and the floor is yours, Charles.
Thank you, Camilo. I will be very brief unless I run the risk of repeating what the previous speakers have already spoken to. Thank you, panelists. I will not take too much of your time. I'll speak to three issues relating it to the IGAD regional context. First, I'll look at the phases of the emergency itself. I will talk about the health emergency, and then when we move towards the easement of restrictions and try to postulate going forward. Of course, for Eastern Horn of Africa, migration is a means of survival. We all survive and depend on human mobility. And this is just not for refugees or migrants themselves, but we also have a huge population of cross-border communities who are have ties, cultural ties across both contexts, and their daily survival depends on migration. So when the COVID pandemic happened, of course, government introduced containment measures, which largely included lockdowns, border closures, and social distancing measures. And this largely affected major cities. So you'll have a city like Nairobi, Kampala, Addis Ababa being on lockdown, or that is where you had a lot of restriction. And if you're to come back again to the regional dynamics, most of these urban cities are the ones that host, say, the most resilient migrants and refugee populations are those who are hosted in the big cities because they do not require assistance from humanitarian organizations. They are more self-reliant. So with the introduction of restrictions and lockdown, most of them either ended up losing their employment or livelihood. And we had huge masses of floating urban population, including migrants and refugees, who basically had no jobs and required some form of humanitarian assistance. In Djibouti, for example, we had a total of close to 10,000 Ethiopian families who were stranded without income, without any jobs, and they basically could not have a means of sustenance. So they required urgent humanitarian assistance. And then also across the region, what we realized is that, of course, with the onset of the pandemic, there was this fear of the foreigner. And we had a lot of involuntary returns or deportation, mainly transiting through urban areas, but destined for rural areas. So they are transiting through major areas because of the, say, the connectivity, like Addis Ababa because of the airport, Nairobi because of JKIA, but their destination was not really in the urban areas. They were going to the rural areas. But we also have to bear in mind that when COVID set in the East and Horn of Africa, we already have experiencing other pandemics. We had the locust invasion, which was threatening food security, especially in the rural areas. And then COVID came into play with the lockdowns and what have you. So already food security was threatened in a way. And that's, of course, I'll come to it again when you go into the post-recovery and recovery phase. And then the other thing that we also saw in the region as a result of this, of course, is the decline in remittances. And the decline in remittances, again, it targets mainly the rural households, and it supports mainly basic services like education, health, food, and that kind of thing. So you'll find this had a direct impact on the rural households, mainly the rural households, yeah? And then when we came after, once there was some form of easing of restrictions in the major urban areas, what we were seeing because of the floating urban population that had lost their job, most of them tried to move back to rural areas. So we had like a reverse migration pattern to rural areas. Mainly because it's cheaper to live in rural areas. You've lost jobs in urban areas. You therefore, as a cost cutting measure, you feel secure to live in the countryside where the cost of living is perhaps not that high and you don't need to pay rent. Plus there's also the opportunity to practice social distancing because of, say, the population ratio in the rural areas. So we saw that, but again, that is not something that we think will be permanent. This is just a temporary measure. I think going forward in the recovery and post-recovery measure period, this is where we are going to see the real crisis, in my view. I'm saying this because this is where we are going to really have the evidence of the impact of the declined economic productivity. Because again, people have lost their jobs, the economies will take time to recover, and you have lack of remittances to rural areas. You have people who moved back to rural areas. And now, because of the other crises like the locust invasion in the rural areas, you have a lot of migratory pressure because, again, the food security there is not guaranteed. The job opportunities might not be sufficient for those who had relocated back. So there'll be pressure to move out of the rural areas, either to urban areas or across national territories to other countries. And the discussion has been the idea of building back better. And for me, I see that idea of building back better provides an opportunity, especially for local municipal authorities. Primarily, I would say also the secondary cities, because the primary cities are congested and they are almost full to capacity. They are strained in a way. But the secondary cities, I see them with the opportunity. If we build back better, and if we are able to integrate them in the planning phase, then they could offer the vent through which we could channel some of this population, where they move into, as we are building back, maybe through the socio-economic recovery measures, we also put into perspective the needs of those who are moving in from rural areas or across national territories, so that we are building with that idea of having migrants and displaced communities in mind. Last and not least, I would also want to specifically mention the issue of displaced population, largely refugees. We know that for the region, at the moment, we have a total population of 12 million displaced population, comprising of 4 million refugees and 8 million IDPs. Most of this population are hosted in rural areas or secondary cities. Some of them, of course, they're in urban areas, but that proportion is pretty low. So currently in the emergency phase, majority of this population have been taken into consideration in terms of inclusion into the health system. At least in the region, the heads of state met and agreed that they will treat everyone equally, regardless of their status of their citizenship status. So everyone was granted equal treatment in the health emergency response. But I'm not so sure this will happen in the recovery phase. Our economies are largely driven, or employment are largely driven by the private sector. And in the private sector, you cannot talk about social protection, those measures, because again, the nature of the migrant jobs are those that are dirty, dangerous, and difficult. Most of them do not enjoy like social protection and what have you. If these are the models that we are going to build back, then it will, we will see increased vulnerabilities, especially for migrants and displaced population. Stephanie, I would want to stop here and perhaps take more in terms of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charles. And I apologize. My connection obviously is also very unstable. Thank you for bringing up all those important points. First of all, that, you know, COVID-19 is one among many challenges actually that the East African region is facing, including, you know, we had floods here, we have the locusts. So there's a general still high level of poverty. There are a lot of displaced people, both refugees and IDPs, which are, you know, vulnerable already due to their migration status. And thank you also for highlighting that many of them live in rural areas where access to services is extremely challenging, or others are living in many secondary cities where local authorities already have a very limited capacity to serve their own populations with the services they might need, which brings us back to the social cohesion point. So thank you for mentioning all of those points. And I really thank you also for mentioning the point about that the real challenges are still to come, because after the sort of health crisis, a lot of regions in the world will actually face the social and economic impacts that this crisis has actually left many countries to face the challenges that are now inclined. So thank you very much, and thank you also very much, ELISA, for your presentation. And it was very touching to actually hear the stories you told about the forcibly displaced persons in the rural areas, and also the disconnect, obviously, between the national and the local level, and actually really highlighting the point that there's conflict happening, which is really very difficult to tackle at this point. So thank you very much for really, that was also one of the comments made in the chat. We're really thankful that you managed to change your presentation and bring over this really crisis dimension again. We've got one more intervention from Josephine Malonza. So thank you very much, first of all, to the speakers in this second panel. I think we've also had really different regions covered, which make the discussion very, very intense. We do have many questions in the chat, and we will not be able to answer all of the questions in the chat. We'll try to follow up. We're taking notes of the information needed, and we'll see as a team how we can actually respond to those questions and also link you to the information you've requested in the chat. So maybe just shortly over to Josephine, over to you for another intervention on and for resuming, and then we'll hand over to Dr. Remy Sitchiping, who's the leader of the Policy and Legislation and Governance section, for some conclusory words. So over to you, Josephine, and thank you to all the speakers. Thank you very much.
I'm still muted, yeah. Thank you very much, Stephanie. You did a great job moderating the session, and all the panelists, I mean, including people that have a very busy portfolio, like the mayor of Colombia that had to join us, despite what's happening at the background that we've just heard from ELISA, and ELISA herself, you know, that had to step up and show up and paint this picture for us. I think all the presentations were amazing. So this is a very, very amazing topic. I want to thank the organizers. Because for me, the discourses around the responses of COVID-19 or urban-rural linkages are equally as important as, you know, the measures or the responses that government are putting in place. So discourses like these are very interesting. I personally enjoyed listening to all the presenters today. Listening to the first set of three speakers and the other set, I think for me what is coming clearly here is actually a question of, you know, what next in terms of opening this box. From Colombia, we've seen that the box is being opened, you know, in the sense of the city being opened to the world. And I think the two speakers that are coming from this area have painted to us the complexities, you know, that are coming alongside that. You know, how acceptable is the situation, you know, to the native residents of these cities or these rural areas. And I think we had quite a lot of that. The second aspect of opening the box is, you know, opening the rural areas. And this is, as Dalia was explaining, as Charles just painted the picture right now, is that the countryside became more preferred, you know, for most urbanites. People want to actually escape from the cities because of, again, the social, the economic impacts that they are going through. And, you know, for some time, people feel trapped in the cities, especially because of the policy. Again, as Professor Rajan was talking about the lockdown policies, people feel trapped in the cities without a good job anymore, without enough food on the table. So what we are seeing is that as soon as the lockdowns are eased, you know, there's this massive migration from the cities to the countrysides. And besides the point that Charles was just raising now, is that the countryside, in my context, or in the larger African context, is that this is also where the elderly populations, you know, are based. So questions have been raised as to what health, you know, impacts or influences, you know, this new wave of urban-rural, you know, migrations is going to cause, especially to the elderly, the senior citizens, we call them, that reside in the countryside. And so again, opening this box exposes us to the need to not just, you know, study urbanization, you know, as an object, but the relations that it has with health and with education. I think it was interesting to hear about the network for healthy cities. There is also a network for learning cities. And there's an exciting project based in the University of Glasgow, the Center for Sustainable, Healthy, and Learning Cities, that was already part of UN-Habitat webinars sometime last month. So I will be sharing the link as well for the people that want to follow, because this is informed by the idea that it's not enough to just study cities. And it is more important to understand cities from the scale of neighborhoods. And it is important to try and understand urbanization in the context of health and education. Because clearly, from the case in Colombia, from the case in India, it was very clear that education is a very important driver. Yeah, I liked that the mayor gave us these 3 waves of migrations into the city. And you could see that the people with a higher level of education, are able to, to build into a resilience and quickly adopt to a new way of living because they have a degree or they have, an education component that helps them to settle a little bit faster than the people that have the lower basic needs. And that was very interesting. So in SHLC, the Sustainable, Healthy and Learning Cities, we look at all these dynamics of education, health, and urbanization. And in terms of the future, I like it that Charles has strongly, raised this flag for us that, the challenge lies ahead. And as Stephanie put it correctly, we do have these socio-economic impacts. And for me, I think discourses like these are also, in a way, the future for this. We need to have more, conversations around this. We need to frame again migration, who actually belongs to the city, because we are hearing from ELISA that farmers have been safe until a few hours ago. Yeah, so who is actually safe in the city, or where is actually safe in the city? So discourses like these can, bring in into perspective, the different complexities around this. And I think just one last intervention here is that I think that the discussion today might have focused on large scale or, a big scale, what we call the macro scale dynamics of mobility. But we must also not forget that the micro scale mobility, we are being forced to appreciate the rights that we have for freedom. The fact that during a lockdown, I'm not able to see my neighbor, okay? I'm not able to take my car to work or a bus to the market, so even the micro scale, components of mobility and social life and all that also get affected in the end. So I would like to stop here, and maybe if there's time, I would come back again with a second round of interventions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josephine, very much appreciated. And as you said, I mean, not only that the disease actually doesn't discriminate, it's also that, the lockdown restrictions, they also don't discriminate. So, well, in Nairobi, we couldn't cross city boundaries for the last 4 months. And, that, as Dr. Santino also mentioned in the beginning, also those insecurities impact productivity. They also impact mental health of everybody, and they also really impact the way people interact with each other. So there is a real strong social component that sort of goes along with it. Let's see, I think we don't really have a lot of time, as I said, that we can take another couple of questions. We have to finish on time, and I think I would maybe like to hand over to Dr. Remy Sitchiping to now sort of provide some closing remarks. First of all, from my side, I would really like to thank all the speakers for their great participation, for their great contributions. Also, thank you very much for the audience, because we now have such a huge number of questions which actually really show the interest in this topic, in this thematic area, and in the different approaches that were taken in the different regions. So thanks to all of you for listening so attentively and also picking up what the speakers have already said, providing comments and asking questions. I think it was a very interactive webinar. And over to you, Remy, now for some conclusory remarks. And then I think the last word goes back to Camillo also. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for mastering this very important discussion that we just had. Join you to congratulate all the contributors, all the participants, discussants, and of course, all the colleagues who had put a lot of effort in making this happen, from Camilo to Thomas to Florence to Grace and Lay, Elle, and so forth. So this has been great. Many great lessons from this one. One of the key things I'm taking away from this is that COVID-19 is fundamentally linked to movement by nature. The way it's transmitted, the way it's managed is either through movement or restriction of movement. And when people move, they don't move alone. We move with families, with goods, with services. And that the second thing that I heard, and I was very pleased about it, is this approach of a health connector, connected to food, connected to governance system, connected to equity issues, equality, class. All these issues had been brought to forth. So these two key messages for me are very important. And this cuts across, of course, I would say the roadbed of the territorial approach, the urban-rural linkages. So there's no distinction. And we have heard some of the solutions, some of the ideas that have come out from this discussion based on lessons, say, in India on the importance of cash transfer, that we cannot just come up with one solution, but a composite of solutions to move ahead. So thanks a lot for enriching this series of discussions, of webinar. We are having to advance our understanding and adjust better to be more resilient and adapt to this context and move forward together. So thanks again, and we see you next time. Back to you, Camilo, for the plan for the next one.
Okay, thank you, Remy. Thank you, Stephanie. This has been a great session. I wish we will have more time to have a little bit more of discussion with the three panelists, but unfortunately, we have to bring the session to an end. So probably in the future, we can extend and go deeper in more of the topics that came to the light, not to the light, but we discussed today in this webinar. So I just want to make the final announcement that we are going to continue this webinar series in September. We're going to take the break in August, but yeah, we will keep you updated. And thank you to the audience, again, to the team, our moderator, Stephanie, for connecting today and being today with us. Bye-bye, and yeah, have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much also to the team. So well done, and thanks to all the participants in the audience. Warm regards. Thank you.